Kdrama in Love presents My Secret Love. Soo Jin grew up in a small town surrounded by mountains, where time seemed to move at a slower pace than in the big cities. Although she loved the tranquility of her home, she always dreamed of something more. From a young age, she had heard stories about Seoul, the vibrant capital, where her older brother, Soo Jin, had moved to attend university. At home, Soo Jin had always been the daddy's girl, protected and pampered. However, as she grew older, her desire to see the outside world increased. One summer afternoon, after finishing her chores, she gathered the courage and approached her parents. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice trembling a little, "I've been thinking, could I go visit Soo Jin in Seoul? I'm 14 now, and I think it's time I see what life is like in the city." Her parents exchanged worried glances. Although they trusted Soo Jin, the idea of letting her travel alone made them uneasy. "It's a big step, Soo Jin," her mother said, with a mix of pride and concern in her voice. "But if your father agrees, you could go for a few days." After a brief silence, her father nodded. "All right, but promise us that you'll take care of yourself and follow your brother's instructions to the letter," her father replied, gently stroking her hair. Soo Jin smiled broadly. She would finally have the chance to see the world she had imagined so often. The day of the trip arrived, and Soo Jin could barely contain her excitement as the bus headed towards Seoul. The changing scenery, from mountains to tall buildings and bustling streets, filled her with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Upon arriving at the Seoul bus station, she looked around, expecting to see her brother. But instead of Soo Jin, a tall, serious yet attractive young man approached her. "Are you Soo Jin?" he asked in a deep, but kind voice. Soo Jin timidly nodded. The young man flashed a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "I'm Minho, your brother's friend. Soo Jin couldn't come, so he asked me to pick you up." As Minho took her suitcase and guided her to his car, Soo Jin couldn't stop looking at him. He had an imposing presence, but at the same time, he radiated warmth. During the ride, Minho made her feel comfortable, asking her about her trip and her expectations of Seoul. "I hope you enjoy your stay here," Minho said as he parked the car in front of the apartment. "Soo Jin and I will make sure you see the best of the city." Soo Jin smiled, feeling that these days would be special. The apartment where Soo Jin and Minho lived was small but cozy. Soo Jin quickly felt at home, and the two young men did everything possible to make her visit unforgettable. Every day, they took her to explore a new part of the city. One afternoon, while strolling through Seoul's famous amusement park, Soo Jin and Minho briefly separated from Soo Jin, who had gone to buy drinks. Minho suggested they visit a nearby gift shop, where Soo Jin was fascinated by a plush white cat with a pink bow. "It's very cute," Soo Jin commented as she held it in her hands. Minho looked at her with an amused smile. "Do you want me to buy it for you?" he asked playfully. "No, it's not necessary," she replied, blushing slightly. "I was just looking." However, Minho insisted and bought the plush toy without Soo Jin noticing. When they returned to the park, he discreetly hid the bag, planning to surprise her later. The last day of her visit arrived too quickly for Soo Jin. As Minho and Soo Jin accompanied her to the bus station, she couldn't help but feel a lump in her throat. The thought of leaving Seoul, and especially Minho, deeply saddened her. "Promise me you'll come back to visit us soon," Soo Jin said, hugging his sister tightly. Soo Jin nodded, fighting back tears. When the time came to say goodbye to Minho, her heart was pounding. "Take care, Soo Jin," Minho said, smiling warmly at her. "And remember to study hard." As the bus pulled away, Soo Jin couldn't help but cry silently. However, upon arriving home and opening her suitcase, Her sadness turned to amazement and joy when she discovered the cat plush Minho had secretly bought her. Next to the plush toy, a note written in neat, elegant handwriting said, "Study hard, eat well, and live a healthy life." Soo Jin hugged the plush toy tightly, feeling that Minho had left a part of himself with her. Back in her village, Soo Jin tried to return to her normal life, but her mind always drifted back to the memories of those 5 days in Seoul. She found herself thinking about Minho constantly, about his smile, his voice, and how he had cared for her. Her small town now seemed more boring than ever, and the only relief she found was dreaming about her next trip to the city. One afternoon, while chatting with her friends at school, one of them asked how her trip had been. "It was amazing," Soo Jin replied, unable to stop smiling. "Seoul is so different from here. There's so much to see and do." "Did you meet anyone interesting?" another friend asked with a mischievous smile. Soo Jin blushed, thinking of Minho, but quickly changed the subject. "Well, I spent a lot of time with my brother and his friend. It was fun." But deep down, she knew it had been more than fun. It had been special, and every night before going to sleep, she hugged the cat plush, remembering Minho and wondering if he ever thought of her. Over the years, Soo Jin managed to convince her parents to let her visit Seoul once a year. Each trip was a mix of excitement and nervousness, and although she always looked forward to seeing her brother, the truth was that her heart beat faster at the thought of seeing Minho. In each visit, Minho remained as kind and charming as ever, but he always kept a respectful distance, treating Soo Jin like his best friend's little sister. This, though it pained her, also gave her hope that someday, when she grew up, he would see her differently. The year she turned 16, Soo Jin arrived in Seoul with the same excitement as always, but this time, a shadow loomed over her dreams. Upon arriving at the apartment, her brother greeted her enthusiastically, but there was something different in the atmosphere. Soo Jin noticed the tension when Minho arrived, accompanied by a young woman her own age. "Soo Jin, this is my girlfriend, Yoon Soo," Minho said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Soo Jin felt as if the ground had crumbled beneath her feet. She tried to smile and be polite, but she couldn't help feeling that her heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. Soo was kind and charming, but every time Soo Jin looked at her, she couldn't help comparing herself to her. That night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Soo Jin cried silently, feeling that her dream of being with Minho was slipping away. She decided to return to her village earlier than planned, claiming she wasn't feeling well. The pain from that last visit to Seoul didn't easily fade. In the following years, Soo Jin focused on her studies, determined to get into Seoul National University, not just for the prestige, but also because, deep in her heart, she still harbored the hope of being close to Minho. She spent hours studying, sacrificing outings with friends and leisure moments to secure a place at the university. The day she received the acceptance letter, she felt a mix of triumph and fear. On one hand, she was excited to start a new chapter in her life. On the other, she dreaded facing Minho again. After finishing high school, Soo Jin received the long-awaited news that she had been accepted to Seoul National University to study history. Excitement overwhelmed her, but she also felt a certain apprehension. Although she longed to begin this new phase of her life, she knew that returning to Seoul would mean reuniting with Minho, who had been the focus of her thoughts for so long. One night, while having dinner with her parents, they made a proposal that took her by surprise. "Soo Jin," her mother began in a sweet voice, "now that you're going to study in Seoul, your father and I have been thinking. It would be good if you lived with Soo Hyun. He's already settled in the city, and it would be safer for you to have someone familiar nearby." Soo Jin looked at them with a mix of surprise and nervousness. The idea of living with her brother was an excellent option from a practical standpoint, but the fact that Minho would also be living there complicated her feelings. "And Minho?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Soo Hyun told us that Minho is still living with him, her father replied. Both of them are working now, and we believe you'll be well taken care of in their apartment. Soo Jin nodded, though inside she felt a storm of emotions. She knew that accepting this proposal meant being close to Minho again, facing all the feelings she had tried to bury for years. Finally, she decided it was the right thing to do. After all, Seoul was a big city full of opportunities, and having her brother nearby would give her the security she needed. She accepted her parents' proposal and began preparing for the move. The day she moved to Seoul, Soo Jin was filled with nerves. As she traveled to the city, she couldn't stop thinking about what it would be like to live under the same roof as Minho. The last time she had seen him, he still had a girlfriend, and although 2 years had passed, she wasn't sure what to expect. When she arrived at the apartment, she was greeted by her brother with a warm hug. Soo Hyun was excited to have his sister close by and promised to do everything possible to make her feel comfortable in her new home. Minho has been waiting to help you with your things, Soo Hyun said as he guided her into the apartment. Soo Jin's heart skipped a beat at those words. And there he was, Minho, standing in the living room with a smile that hadn't changed at all. Despite the time that had passed, he was still as attractive as ever, and seeing him brought all the feelings she had tried to suppress back to the surface. Welcome back, Soo Jin, Minho said as he approached to help her with the boxes she was carrying. Soo Jin tried to act naturally, though she felt her heart pounding. Minho behaved kindly and courteously, as he always had, but she couldn't help noticing a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Minho took charge of showing her to her new room. The apartment they had rented in the Gangnam district was larger and more modern than the previous one, and Soo Jin's room was spacious and cozy. Minho had carefully chosen the colors and furniture, creating a space that reflected her youthful and feminine style. I hope you like it, Minho said as he placed the last box on the floor. I thought these colors would make you feel comfortable. It's perfect, thank you, Soo Jin replied, sincerely smiling. I love it. Although she tried to remain rational, Minho's closeness and his thoughtful gesture made her feelings resurface strongly. Living with him was going to be a greater challenge than she had anticipated. As she settled into her new university life, Soo Jin faced the duality of her emotions. On one hand, she was excited about everything Seoul had to offer. On the other, she knew she had to protect her heart when Minho was around. But despite her attempts to be rational, the tension between them began to grow with each passing day in the apartment. The first day of classes at the university was a whirlwind of emotions for Soo Jin. She made new friends and began to adapt to life in Seoul, although her mind constantly drifted back to Minho's presence in the apartment. Despite trying to focus on her studies and the new experiences that university offered, Minho remained a recurring thought, a constant echo in her heart. Among her new friends, Park Ji-hoon, a classmate, quickly stood out. He was a friendly guy with an easy smile and a charming personality. Ji-hoon showed interest in Soo Jin from the beginning, and although she tried to seem interested, she always found herself comparing him, consciously or unconsciously, to Minho. One afternoon, after an intense day of classes, Ji-hoon gathered the courage to ask her out. Soo Jin, feeling that she should move on and open herself to new experiences, accepted the invitation. However, that night, while watching a movie at the apartment with Minho, nervousness began to take hold of her. Minho, who had always been perceptive of her mood changes, noticed the unease on her face. Soo Jin, are you okay? He asked, with a tone of concern. You seem a bit distracted. Soo Jin, who had been playing with the edge of her shirt, looked up and met his eyes. She knew she could trust him, but she also knew that talking about her feelings with Minho was delicate territory. It's just that. I have a date with a guy from my class tomorrow, she confessed, trying not to sound too nervous. And I'm a little scared. Minho frowned, processing the information. Scared? Why? He asked, with a gentle tone, but in his eyes, there was a hint of something deeper, something that unsettled him. Soo Jin sighed, trying to find the right words. It's just that I've never been alone with a guy on a date. She paused, feeling the heat rise to her cheeks. I mean, I've never had an experience like that, and it makes me nervous. Minho looked at her in silence for a few seconds, his face masking any emotion he might be feeling. But inside, Minho was grappling with a mix of emotions. The idea of Soo Jin going out with another guy made him feel uncomfortable, something he hadn't anticipated. You shouldn't worry so much, he finally said, trying to sound nonchalant. You're an amazing girl, and any guy would be lucky to be with you. Soo Jin smiled shyly, but there was something in Minho's tone that made her feel even more insecure. She decided to be honest with him. It's just that, you see me as a sister, Minho. But this guy, he'll probably try to kiss me. The words slipped out of her mouth before she could stop them, and instantly, she felt a wave of embarrassment. Minho seemed to tense up. The idea of another guy kissing Soo Jin stirred a whirlwind of emotions inside him. He knew he had always seen her as his best friend's sister, but at that moment, something shifted. The thought of losing her to someone else, of someone else experiencing what he had never allowed himself to, was overwhelming. Soo Jin. His voice was lower now, more intimate, as he leaned slightly toward her. If that's what you're worried about, I can help you with it. Soo Jin blinked, not fully understanding what he meant. Help me? How? But before she could finish the question, Minho had already moved closer, until their faces were just inches apart. Soo Jin felt her heart pounding, as if it were about to leap out of her chest. She could see every detail of Minho's face, the softness of his skin, the intensity of his dark eyes, the line of his lips. Minho hesitated for a second, as if searching for some sign in Soo Jin's face that he shouldn't continue. But what he saw in her eyes was a mixture of anticipation and desire. And that was all he needed. With an almost painful gentleness, Minho brought his lips to hers. At first, the contact was barely a brush, a light gesture full of tenderness. Soo Jin closed her eyes, letting herself be carried away by the sensation. His lips were warm, and the touch, though light, made her shiver. When Minho felt her respond, he pressed a little more, moving his lips over hers with delicacy. Soo Jin felt the world around her fade away, and all that existed at that moment was the warmth of his lips, the softness of his touch, the way his hand slowly slid up to rest on her cheek, holding her tenderly. The kiss, though soft and measured, was charged with an intensity that both of them could feel. Soo Jin had never experienced anything so intimate, so full of meaning. The way Minho moved his lips over hers, the way their breaths intertwined, everything felt like a perfectly orchestrated symphony. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity and at the same time a fleeting instant, Minho slowly pulled away. He opened his eyes and looked at her intently, trying to decipher what was going on in Soo Jin's mind. Soo Jin remained silent, her lips still tingling from the contact. The warmth in her face didn't fade, and her heart kept beating hard. She didn't know what to say or how to react. She had dreamed so much of this moment that now that it had finally happened, she felt overwhelmed. Minho, for his part, seemed equally bewildered. He had never thought that kissing Soo Jin would be like this, so full of conflicting emotions. He knew he had crossed a line, but he wasn't sure what that meant for them. Finally, Soo Jin broke the silence, her voice trembling. Minho. She began, but didn't know how to continue. Minho looked at her, and for a moment, it seemed like he was going to say something, but instead, he moved slightly away, running a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that, he murmured, though his eyes said otherwise. He didn't regret the kiss, but he was confused about what it meant. Soo Jin shook her head, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "No, it's okay," she said, though inside, nothing was clear. The silence that followed was heavy, full of unanswered questions. Both of them knew that something had changed between them, but neither was ready to face it. Finally, Minho got up from the couch, muttering something about having work to do, and retreated to his room, leaving Soo Jin alone with her thoughts. Soo Jin remained sitting on the couch, feeling like her world had changed irrevocably in a single moment. The kiss had been everything she had always wanted, and yet, it had also filled her with confusion and doubts. She didn't know what it meant for Minho, and more importantly, she didn't know how to handle her own feelings. That night, while trying to sleep, Soo Jin's thoughts kept returning to the kiss. The way Minho had looked at her before and after, the way their lips had met, it was all a vivid memory she couldn't erase. She knew she would have to face what had happened, but she wasn't sure how to do it without risking what was left of her relationship with Minho. And so, with her heart pounding and her mind in turmoil, Soo Jin finally drifted off to sleep, but that night, Soo Jin could barely sleep. She thought over and over about the kiss, about how her lips had moved over Minho's, and the way he had looked at her afterward. But in the morning, Minho had already left for work, leaving her alone with her thoughts. That afternoon, Ji-hoon took her to the movies. Although Soo Jin tried to focus on the film and enjoy her time with Ji-hoon, she couldn't help comparing him to Minho. At the end of the date, Ji-hoon kissed her, but the kiss was awkward and didn't stir any emotion in her. When she returned to the apartment, she found Minho waiting on the couch, with a serious expression on his face. "How was your date?" he asked, his voice loaded with a tension that Soo Jin hadn't expected. "It was fine," she replied, but she couldn't hide the disappointment in her voice. Minho slowly stood up and approached her. "Soo Jin," he said, in a softer tone. "I don't want you to keep seeing that guy." Soo Jin looked at him, surprised. "Why?" she asked, feeling her heart begin to beat faster. Minho sighed and looked at her with an intensity she had never seen before. "Because I like you, Soo Jin. I've realized that I can't keep seeing you just as Soo Hyun's sister. You're more than that to me, and after kissing you last night, I know there's no turning back." Soo Jin felt her heart race. She wanted to jump for joy, but instead, she decided to play with the situation. "Well," she said, pretending indifference, "if you want me to stop seeing Ji-hoon, you'll have to make me like being with you more." Minho smiled at her challenge and kissed her again, this time with more passion and without the confusion he had felt the previous night. The weeks that followed the kiss between Soo Jin and Minho were a mix of sweet moments and uncertainty. Although both knew that something deep had changed in their relationship, neither dared to name it or define it clearly. However, their closeness began to grow naturally, as if the invisible barrier that had always separated them had vanished. They hid their relationship from Soo Hyun, carrying on their romance in secret. With Soo Hyun's departure to Busan for work, Minho and Soo Jin were left alone in the apartment. Although both felt somewhat uncomfortable with the idea at first, daily life together gradually brought them closer. One night, after a long day of studies and work, Minho and Soo Jin decided to go out for a milkshake and walk by the Han River. The night breeze was cool and pleasant, and the city lights reflected on the water, creating an almost magical atmosphere. They walked in silence, enjoying each other's company, with the murmur of the river accompanying their stroll. Soo Jin broke the silence, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Minho, we've been secretly dating for months. Sometimes, I wonder if this is just a dream," she said while looking ahead with a mix of anxiety and hope. Minho looked at her with an intensity that reflected the depth of his feelings. His eyes met Soo Jin's, and she could see the vulnerability and sincerity in his gaze. Soo Jin, Minho began, stopping for a moment to take her hand. This isn't a dream. What I feel for you is real and deep. I've been thinking about us, about how we've grown together and what this means. Soo Jin felt the warmth of his hand and the sincerity in his words. Her heart was pounding, and a wave of emotion washed over her. I know. For a long time, I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you how much you mean to me. You've made me feel things I never imagined, and I realize that I can't keep hiding it, Soo Jin confessed, her voice trembling slightly. I love you, Minho. More than words can express. Minho looked at her with tenderness and determination. His lips curved into a warm smile. I love you too, Soo Jin. Since we started dating, I knew there was something special between us. It hasn't been easy keeping this a secret, but every moment was worth it. You make me happy in a way I never thought possible. Soo Jin felt relieved and excited to hear those words. The weight of uncertainty faded away, replaced by palpable joy. Minho embraced her tightly, and she surrendered to the warmth of his embrace, feeling that everything finally made sense. So, what do we do now? Soo Jin asked, resting her head on his shoulder. Now, Minho replied, pulling back slightly to look into her eyes, we can be honest with ourselves and with others. There's no need to hide what we feel. I'm ready to face any challenge, as long as we're together. That night, after their walk, they returned to the apartment, but the tension between them had changed. There was a current of anticipation in the air, an expectation that both could feel. Soo Jin knew she was ready to take another step, to set aside any fear or doubt. Minho felt it too. After a light dinner, they found themselves sitting on the couch, watching a movie that neither was really following. Minho's hands rested on Soo Jin's, and she could feel the warmth emanating from him, the way his fingers intertwined with hers, transmitting a sense of security and desire at the same time. Finally, Soo Jin gathered her courage. She took a deep breath and turned toward him. Minho, I want to, she whispered, but before she could continue, Minho interrupted her, his voice soft yet firm. I know, Soo Jin, he said, looking into her eyes. I want it too, and I want to do it right, with you. Soo Jin looked at him intently, and with a firmness that surprised them both, she replied, I'm sure. Minho didn't need more words. He leaned in and kissed her with a passion that both had been holding back for a long time. The kiss was deep, full of promises and desires, a connection that surpassed anything they had experienced before. As they kissed, Minho lifted her in his arms and gently carried her to her room. Soo Jin clung to him, feeling her heart beat in sync with Minho's. When they reached the room, Minho carefully laid her down on the bed and sat beside her, looking at her with a mix of love and desire. You're so beautiful, Soo Jin, he murmured, running a hand through her hair. You don't know how much I've dreamed of this moment. Soo Jin blushed, but she didn't look away. I have too, Minho, she responded, raising a hand to caress his face. I never thought this would be possible. Minho smiled softly before leaning in to kiss her again. This time, the kiss was more intense, charged with a need that they both shared. With slow and careful movements, Minho began to undress her, making sure that each touch was gentle, respectful, and full of love. Soo Jin felt her body respond to each of Minho's caresses. It was as if every kiss, every brush of his hands on her skin, ignited a fire inside her that she had never experienced before. When they were finally both naked, Minho paused for a moment to admire her, his gaze filled with adoration and tenderness. You don't have to worry about anything, he whispered as he leaned over her. I'm here for you, always. Soo Jin nodded, feeling a mix of emotions. There was nervousness, but above all, a deep trust in Minho. She knew he would take care of her, that he would do everything possible to make this night special. When Minho kissed her again, Soo Jin gave herself completely to the sensation. Minho's hands roamed her body with tenderness, exploring every inch, making her feel desired and loved. She responded with the same intensity, caressing his body, feeling the strength and gentleness that coexisted in him. The moment they joined was like an explosion of sensations for both. Minho moved slowly, making sure that Soo Jin was comfortable with each step. Every movement, every sigh, was filled with a perfect harmony, as if their bodies were made for each other. Soo Jin felt her body tense and then relax under Minho's touch. The pleasure she experienced was so intense, so overwhelming, that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. But Minho's presence, his whispered words in her ear, the reality of their bodies united, all made her aware that it was real, that they were finally together. After what seemed like an eternity, but at the same time a fleeting moment, they both reached their climax together, with a shared sigh that filled the room. Minho held her in his arms as they both caught their breath, their hearts beating in unison. "I love you, Soo Jin," Minho whispered, with a sincerity that made her feel as if the whole world centered on that moment. "I love you too, Minho," she replied, snuggling closer to him, feeling how peace and happiness enveloped her. That night, as they fell asleep in each other's arms, they knew that nothing would ever be the same. They had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, but they knew it was the right line, the beginning of something beautiful and true. Everything changed when Soo Hyun unexpectedly returned to the apartment the next morning. Soo Jin and Minho had spent the night together for the first time and were enjoying a relaxed breakfast when Soo Hyun walked in and found them in a compromising situation. "What the hell is going on here?" Soo Hyun shouted, his face flushed with anger. Minho tried to calm him down, explaining that what he felt for Soo Jin was sincere, but Soo Hyun didn't want to listen to reason. Furious, he punched Minho, accusing him of seducing and taking advantage of his sister. "Enough, Soo Hyun!" Soo Jin yelled, stepping between them. "This isn't Minho's fault. We love each other." Soo Hyun, unable to process what he was hearing, locked himself in his room, leaving Soo Jin and Minho in a state of anguish. Following the incident, Minho decided it would be best to move out temporarily, to give Soo Hyun space and avoid further conflicts. The weeks following the tense confrontation with Soo Hyun were difficult for Soo Jin. Although Minho had moved to a nearby apartment to give her brother some space, the absence of his constant presence weighed heavily on the atmosphere. Soo Jin felt trapped between the love she felt for Minho and the pain her brother was experiencing. One night, when Soo Jin could no longer bear the tension, she decided it was time to talk to Soo Hyun and explain everything. She knew her brother was angry, disappointed, and confused, but she also knew that he loved her and that, deep down, he wanted the best for her. She knocked on his bedroom door, and after a moment of hesitation, she heard Soo Hyun's voice inviting her in. He was sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers, but he looked up when he saw her enter. "What do you want, Soo Jin?" he asked, his voice tired and tense. Soo Jin took a deep breath, preparing for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. "Oppa, I need you to listen to me. I can't go on like this, with this tension between us. I want you to understand how important Minho is to me." Soo Hyun frowned but didn't say anything, so Soo Jin continued. "I know it hurts you to think that your best friend and I are together, but there's something you need to know, something I haven't told you before," she said, feeling her hands start to tremble. "I've been in love with Minho since I was 14. Soo Hyun looked at her, visibly surprised by the confession. It wasn't what he had expected to hear, and for a moment, he was speechless. "Since you were 14, he finally murmured, disbelief in his voice. Soo Jin nodded, feeling a mix of relief and fear swirl in her chest as she revealed her truth. "Yes, since the first moment I saw him. When he picked me up at the bus station, I felt something I had never felt before. And even though I knew that to him I was just his friend's little sister, I couldn't help falling more in love every time I saw him. All those years, every time I came back to Seoul, it was because I wanted to be near him, even if he didn't know it. Soo Hyun ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what his sister had just said. He had known Minho for years, considered him a close friend, but he had never realized the feelings his sister had been secretly harboring. I had no idea, he whispered, still in shock. Why didn't you ever tell me? Soo Jin gave a sad smile. Because I knew you wouldn't have understood. You'd have thought it was just a childish crush, something that would pass. But it didn't pass, Oppa. It never did. And now, finally, after all these years, we're together. Please understand how important this is to me. I've loved him for so long, and I don't want to lose him now that we've finally found each other. Soo Hyun looked at her for a long moment, his eyes reflecting a mix of emotions. Finally, he sighed and stepped closer to his sister, taking her hands. I don't know what to say, Soo Jin. It's hard to accept that things have changed so much. But if you've really loved him for so long, I can't be the one to keep you apart. He paused, searching for the right words. I just want you to be happy. Soo Jin felt tears well up in her eyes and nodded, hugging her brother tightly. Thank you, Oppa. It means so much to me that you understand. The next day, Soo Jin met Minho at a nearby cafe where they had been meeting during the weeks they had been apart. When they sat together, Soo Jin decided to share with him the conversation she had had with her brother. I told Soo Hyun how I feel about you. For years, she said, her voice soft but firm. Minho looked up, surprised. What did you tell him? He asked, a mix of curiosity and concern in his voice. I told him I've been in love with you since I was 14, Soo Jin confessed, blushing a little as she recalled those first youthful feelings. Minho remained silent for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Then, a slow but wide smile began to form on his face. Since you were 14, he repeated, with a tone of surprise and tenderness. So, since we met at the bus station. Soo Jin nodded, her eyes filled with sincerity. Yes, from that moment. Although it was a secret love at first, it never stopped growing. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was always there. Minho took Soo Jin's hand with a tenderness that made her feel a comforting warmth. I never imagined those feelings were there from the beginning, he said, emotion palpable in his voice. But somehow, I feel like our fate started intertwining from that day. Even though it took time, even though we didn't know it, we were always meant to truly find each other. Soo Jin looked into his eyes, seeing in them the reflection of what she had always hoped for, what she had always desired. Maybe we always knew, in a way, she whispered, squeezing his hand. And now that we're here, I don't want anything or anyone to separate us. Minho nodded, with a sincere smile that lit up his entire face. I won't let that happen, Soo Jin. We're in this together, and I'm not going to let anything pull us apart. At that moment, Soo Jin knew there was no turning back. They were together, and although challenges remained on their path, they were both willing to face them, knowing that their love, cultivated over the years, was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. The morning sun gently filtered through the curtains, filling the room with a warm golden light. Soo Jin woke up slowly, feeling the comforting weight of Minho's arm around her waist. She smiled as she turned her head to see him, still asleep, with a peaceful expression on his face. Several years had passed since those days filled with uncertainty and intense emotions. Now, they were married and living in a cozy home in Seoul, building the life they had always dreamed of together. Every day, Soo Jin woke up grateful for the life they shared, knowing that all the difficulties they had faced had only strengthened their love. Careful not to wake him, Soo Jin slipped out of bed and headed to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. As she whisked the eggs, she couldn't help but glance at the ring on her finger, the symbol of the promise they had made to each other. Promises of love, support, and loyalty, through good times and bad. Minho appeared in the kitchen doorway shortly after, his hair tousled and a sleepy smile on his face. "Jagia, good morning," he said playfully, coming closer to kiss her on the cheek. Soo Jin laughed softly, still feeling that flutter in her stomach every time he called her that. "Good morning, Jagia," she replied, turning to return the kiss, this time on his lips. As they ate breakfast together, they talked about plans for the future, as they often did. They dreamed of traveling, continuing to grow in their careers, and perhaps, in the not-so-distant future, starting a family. Every conversation they shared was a reminder of everything they had achieved together, of how they had overcome every obstacle to get to this point. After breakfast, they went for a walk in the nearby park, enjoying the morning freshness and the simple pleasure of being together. They walked hand in hand, as they had done so many times before, but now with the certainty that their destinies were truly intertwined, not just in that moment, but forever. Minho suddenly stopped, gently pulling Soo Jin's hand to turn her toward him. He looked at her with a tenderness that still gave her butterflies in her stomach. "Not a single day goes by that I'm not grateful for finding you, Jagia," he said, with sincerity in every word. "Everything we've been through has brought us here, to this moment, and I wouldn't change any of it." Soo Jin smiled, her eyes shining with the same love she had felt since she was a teenager. "Neither would I, Jagia. No matter what comes, as long as we're together, I know everything will be all right." They embraced under the clear sky, surrounded by the sounds of the city waking up. In that moment, they both knew that their love, forged in adversity and nurtured over the years, was stronger than ever. They were ready for whatever life had to offer, knowing that, no matter what, they would always have each other. As they walked away from the park, the future smiled upon them, full of promises and shared adventures. They had found their destiny in each other's arms, and they were ready to continue writing their story, one chapter at a time, together, forever. The end. If you enjoyed this K-drama, don't forget to follow our channel Simplement Kdramas, share it with your friends, and listen to more K-drama stories full of love and emotions.